The first light of dawn spilled across the endless Montana prairie, turning the rolling grasslands into a sea of gold. Frost still clung to the fence posts, and a cold breeze drifted down from the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. On the western edge of the valley stood Black Creek Ranch, once one of the proudest ranches in Montana territory. Its weathered barns leaned slightly with age. Broken fences stretched across tired pastures, and the cattle that remained were thin after 2 years of drought. Yet despite its hardships, one man refused to abandon it. 38-year-old Jacob Walker tightened the saddle on his favorite horse, Thunder. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived countless winters, Jacob had built his reputation with honesty rather than wealth. His dark beard showed the first streaks of gray, and years beneath the western sun had etched determination across his face. Everyone in Montana respected Jacob, everyone except the powerful Ashcroft family. The Ashcrofts owned nearly every profitable ranch, bank, and trading company for hundreds of miles. Jonathan Ashcroft believed every piece of land in Montana should belong to him. Only one ranch refused to sell, Black Creek. Jacob had turned down Jonathan's offers 6 different times. Jonathan never forgave him. Inside the grand Ashcroft mansion, Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair while his oldest son, Edward, spread several papers across the desk. "Walker won't sell," Edward said. "He will. Not willingly." Jonathan smiled slowly. "There are other ways to destroy a stubborn man." Edward looked curious. "You've already cut off his bank loans." Jonathan nodded. "You bought his cattle contracts." "Yes." "You convinced merchants not to trade with him." "I did." Edward frowned. "And still he survives." Jonathan stood and walked toward the window, overlooking thousands of acres that already belonged to him. "Then we'll destroy him from the inside." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jonathan picked up a letter resting on the desk. "Do you remember Abigail?" Edward laughed. "The school teacher. The one every gentleman in town refused to marry." Edward nodded. "She's educated. Too educated. Independent. Too independent. And people call her useless because she'd rather read books than cook supper." Jonathan smiled. "Exactly." Edward still looked confused. "What does she have to do with Walker?" Jonathan folded the letter carefully. "The county judge owes me several favors." A slow smile spread across Edward's face. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am." 3 days later, Jacob rode into the small town of Red Pine to collect supplies he could barely afford. Instead, Sheriff Thomas Reed handed him an official envelope sealed with the county stamp. Jacob frowned. "What's this?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Judge says you should read it." Jacob broke the seal. His face remained expressionless until he reached the final paragraph. Then he looked up in disbelief. "This has to be some kind of joke." Thomas sighed. "I wish it was." The letter informed Jacob that, according to the final wishes of his late Uncle Samuel Walker, a legal agreement required Jacob to marry Abigail Carter within 30 days to inherit the remaining section of Walker land bordering Black Creek Ranch. Without the marriage, the land would automatically transfer to Jonathan Ashcroft. Jacob read the letter again and again. "It makes no sense. The judge says the will is legally binding." Jacob removed his hat and rubbed his forehead. "My uncle never even mentioned this." Thomas quietly replied. Nobody knew. Across town, Abigail Carter sat inside the small schoolhouse, organizing books after another long day of teaching. Unlike most frontier women, Abigail believed education could build a stronger future than wealth alone. She read newspapers from Boston. She studied farming journals. She kept notebooks filled with ideas about irrigation, livestock breeding, soil improvement, bookkeeping, and business. The townspeople laughed behind her back. "What good are books on a ranch? A wife belongs in a kitchen." She never survived ranch life. Abigail ignored them. She had grown used to whispers. Her parents had died during a winter epidemic years earlier, leaving her with little besides their books and their belief that knowledge mattered. That afternoon, Sheriff Reed quietly entered the schoolhouse. "I've brought news." Abigail smiled politely. "Good or bad?" "I'm afraid both." He handed her the same legal document. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Finally she whispered, "So I'm expected to marry a man I've never met. I'm sorry." She looked toward the mountains outside the window. "And if I refuse?" The inheritance disappears. She lowered the paper. Who benefits? The sheriff hesitated. Jonathan Ashcroft. Everything suddenly made sense. She had heard enough stories about Jonathan to know kindness was never part of his plans. Meanwhile, Jacob spent the evening sitting alone on the porch of Black Creek Ranch. The ranch had belonged to his family for nearly 50 years. Every fence post reminded him of his father. Every pasture carried memories of his mother. He refused to let Ashcroft take it. But marriage? To a complete stranger? The following week arrived faster than either Jacob or Abigail expected. The wedding took place inside the tiny wooden church overlooking Red Pine. No music, no celebration, only the judge, the sheriff, the preacher, and a handful of curious townspeople, eager to witness what many called the strangest marriage in Montana. Jonathan Ashcroft watched from the back row. His smile never faded. Jacob stood stiffly in a clean blue work shirt and black cowboy hat. Across the aisle, Abigail wore a simple cream-colored prairie dress with long sleeves and a modest lace collar. She carried no flowers. Neither looked particularly happy. When the preacher asked whether Jacob accepted Abigail as his wife, he answered quietly, "I do." When Abigail spoke the same words, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I do." Within minutes, it was over. Outside the church, awkward silence settled between them. Jacob finally extended his hand. "I suppose we're married." Abigail shook it gently. "I suppose we are." The wagon ride back to Black Creek Ranch felt endless. Neither knew what to say. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "I should tell you something." She looked at him. "I don't expect this marriage to be anything more than an agreement." She nodded calmly. "I wasn't expecting romance." He almost smiled. "That's probably for the best." When Black Creek Ranch finally appeared across the valley, Abigail studied it carefully. Weathered buildings, broken windmill, dry fields, weak cattle. She noticed everything. More importantly, she noticed why. That evening, Jacob apologized while serving a simple supper. "I'm afraid ranch life isn't comfortable." Abigail quietly looked around the kitchen. The roof leaked. The pantry was nearly empty. The accounting ledger sat open on the table. Bills were stacked beside it. Without asking permission, she glanced at the numbers. Within 5 minutes, she understood exactly why the ranch was failing. Jacob noticed her studying the books. "You understand bookkeeping?" "A little." He shrugged. "Won't help much." She closed the ledger gently. "It might." He smiled politely. "You haven't even been here a day." "No, but I already know your biggest mistake." Jacob laughed. "You work fast. You've been selling cattle, individually instead of through seasonal cooperative contracts." His smile disappeared. She continued, "Your irrigation ditch loses nearly half its water because of the broken northern channel." Jacob stared. She pointed toward another page. "And your hay storage allows moisture underneath the stacks. That's why nearly 20% spoiled last winter." Silence filled the room. Finally, Jacob asked, "How do you know all that?" Abigail answered honestly, "I've spent years studying successful ranches." He looked around the old kitchen, then back at the woman everyone called useless. For the first time, he wasn't sure the town had been right. Hundreds of miles away, Jonathan Ashcroft received word that the marriage had been completed. He smiled confidently. "Excellent." Edward frowned. "You don't seem worried." Jonathan poured another glass of whiskey. "I'm not." What if she actually helps him? Jonathan laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. "A school teacher?" He shook his head. "She'd destroy that ranch faster than drought ever could." Neither man realized the woman they had mocked for years wasn't just educated. She possessed the knowledge, determination, and courage that would soon change the future of Black Creek Ranch. And eventually make it the richest ranch in all of Montana. The sun rose over Black Creek Ranch like the promise of a new beginning. Golden light spilled across the rolling Montana plains, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Abigail Walker stood on the front porch before sunrise, a notebook in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. While Jacob had already ridden out to inspect the cattle, Abigail carefully observed every corner of the ranch. She wasn't simply looking, she was studying. Every broken fence, every dry pasture, every leaking trough, and every neglected field revealed a problem waiting to be solved. When Jacob returned, he found Abigail measuring the flow of water through the ranch's irrigation ditch with a wooden stick. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to find out where your water disappears." Jacob chuckled. "It disappears because the drought takes it." Abigail smiled. "No, the drought takes some of it. Your broken irrigation ditch takes the rest." She walked several hundred yards to the northern canal and pointed toward a large crack hidden beneath weeds. "Half your water leaks into the ground before it reaches the fields." Jacob stared silently. For years he had blamed nature. He had never thought to blame the ditch. Within 2 days, Abigail organized the ranch hands to repair the entire irrigation system. Water that had once disappeared now flowed evenly through every pasture. For the first time in months, patches of green began appearing across the ranch. The workers looked at one another in amazement. "Maybe the school teacher knows something after all," one ranch hand whispered. Abigail wasn't finished. She spent hours studying the cattle, carefully recording which animals gained weight quickly and which remained weak. She separated the healthiest, breeding stock from the rest and created grazing rotations that allowed the grass to recover naturally. Jacob watched in disbelief. "You learned all this from books?" "And from listening," Abigail replied. "People underestimate how much you can learn when you pay attention." Within weeks, the cattle looked stronger. Calves gained weight faster. Even the horses seemed healthier. Word slowly spread across Montana. People who had laughed at Abigail now rode miles just to see what she was doing differently. But success always attracts enemies. Jonathan Ashcroft wasn't pleased. His son Edward stormed into the study carrying a newspaper. "They're calling Black Creek the fastest improving ranch in the territory." Jonathan crushed the paper in his fist. "Impossible. They've already signed new cattle contracts." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Then it's time for stronger measures." A week later, disaster struck. Just before dawn, Jacob woke to the frantic sound of horses. Smoke filled the air. "The barn," one ranch hand shouted. Jacob and Abigail rushed outside. Flames climbed toward the skies. The largest hay barn burned fiercely. The entire valley glowed orange beneath the fire. Neighbors raced from nearby ranches carrying buckets of water. For hours they fought the blaze. By sunrise the fire was finally out. Half the winter hay supply had been destroyed. One exhausted ranch hand muttered, "It couldn't have started by itself." Jacob silently examined the ashes. Near the rear entrance he found a broken lantern. Its glass had been smashed deliberately. Someone had set the fire. Sheriff Reed arrived later that morning. After inspecting the scene, he sighed. "No proof." Jacob clenched his fists. "I know who did it." "So do I. But knowing and proving aren't the same thing." That evening Jacob sat alone on the porch, staring at the burned remains of the barn. "We'll never recover before winter." Abigail quietly sat beside him. "We will." "How?" She handed him a notebook. Inside were pages of detailed calculations. "We'll sell premium breeding stock instead of ordinary cattle." Jacob frowned. "We've never done that." "Exactly," she continued. "We'll plant alfalfa instead of common hay. It grows faster and feeds better." Jacob turned another page. "We'll raise sheep too." "Diversify," Abigail said. "If one market fails, another survives." Jacob looked at her in astonishment. "You've planned the next 5 years." She smiled gently. "I planned them the first night I arrived, for the first time since his parents had died." Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The weeks passed quickly. Together they rebuilt the barn. Neighbors volunteered lumber. The blacksmith donated new tools. Mrs. Harper baked meals for every worker. Little by little, Black Creek Ranch became more than a business. It became a community. As autumn arrived, the ranch hosted its first livestock auction. Buyers from across Montana gathered to inspect Abigail's carefully bred cattle. Jonathan Ashcroft watched from across the street. His confidence faded with every successful sale. When the final numbers were counted, Black Creek had earned more money in one afternoon than it had during the previous 2 years combined. Edward stared in disbelief. "They're winning." Jonathan remained silent. For the first time in decades, he was afraid. That evening Jacob and Abigail celebrated quietly beneath the stars. "You saved this ranch," Jacob said. Abigail shook her head. "No." She looked toward the workers laughing around a campfire. "We all did." Jacob smiled. "When you first arrived, everyone called you useless." She laughed softly. "I remember. They were wrong. She looked into his eyes. I know. Neither noticed how close they had become. Neither realized their partnership had quietly become friendship, and friendship was slowly becoming something far deeper. But happiness rarely lasts long on the frontier. 3 days later, Sheriff Reed rode into the ranch at full speed. His horse was covered in sweat. "Jacob," he shouted. Jacob hurried from the barn. "What happened?" The sheriff handed him an official document. Jonathan Ashcroft had filed a lawsuit claiming ownership of the eastern grazing lands that Black Creek depended upon. The court hearing was scheduled in only 10 days. If Jonathan won, Black Creek would lose nearly half its pasture. Without that land, the ranch could never survive another winter. Jacob looked at Abigail. This is the fight he's been waiting for. She slowly folded the document. Then we'll give him one he never expected. Far away, inside the Ashcroft mansion, Jonathan smiled as he looked over a large map of Black Creek Ranch. "By this time next month," he said confidently, "Jacob Walker won't own enough land to keep a single herd alive." He believed victory was certain. What he didn't know was that Abigail had just uncovered an old survey map hidden inside Jacob's late father's trunk, and that forgotten map contained a secret capable of destroying Jonathan Ashcroft's case forever. The battle for Black Creek Ranch had only just begun. A cold autumn wind swept across Black Creek. Ranchers Jacob Walker and Abigail stood in the old ranch house, studying the faded survey map spread across the kitchen table. The map had been hidden for nearly 20 years inside Jacob's late father's wooden trunk. Its edges were yellow with age, but the ink remained clear. It showed the original property lines of Black Creek Ranch, signed and sealed by the territorial surveyor years before. Jonathan Ashcroft began buying land throughout Montana. Abigail carefully traced the boundary with her finger. "This proves the eastern grazing land has always belonged to your family." Jacob nodded slowly. "If the court accepts it, it will." Jacob looked at her. "You're certain?" She smiled. "I've never been more certain of anything." 3 days later, the small courthouse in Red Pine was packed with ranchers, merchants, and townspeople. Everyone wanted to witness the legal battle that had divided the valley. Jonathan Ashcroft arrived dressed in an expensive black suit, followed by his son Edward and 2 lawyers from Helena. Jacob entered quietly beside Abigail. Unlike Jonathan, they brought no lawyers, only the truth. Judge William Carter called the courtroom to order. Jonathan's attorney confidently presented forged deeds, recent surveys, and witness statements claiming the eastern pasture belonged to Ashcroft Ranch. The room remained silent. When it was Abigail's turn to speak, many people exchanged doubtful glances. The school teacher, what does she know about land? Abigail calmly walked to the judge's desk carrying the old survey map, her notebook, and several carefully preserved records. She unfolded the map. This survey was completed 23 years ago by territorial surveyor Henry Collins. She placed the original county seal beside it. Then she produced old tax records proving Jacob's family had paid taxes on the disputed land every single year. Finally, she revealed a forgotten journal written by Jacob's father. Inside were detailed notes describing fence construction, grazing records, and property boundaries dating back decades. The courtroom fell silent. Jonathan's attorney examined the documents. His face turned pale. "They're authentic." Jonathan stood abruptly. "Impossible." Abigail looked directly at him. "The truth usually is, to those who've spent years hiding from it." The judge spent nearly an hour reviewing every document. Finally, he removed his glasses. "This court finds that the eastern grazing lands legally belong to Jacob Walker." A cheer erupted throughout the courtroom. The fraudulent claim filed by Jonathan Ashcroft is dismissed. Jonathan's face turned bright red. Before he could leave, Sheriff Reed stepped forward. "I have one more matter." He handed the judge another file. Evidence regarding the fire at Black Creek Ranch. Several former Ashcroft Ranch hands had finally come forward. They confessed Jonathan had paid them to burn Jacob's hay barn. One by one, they testified under oath. Jonathan realized his empire was collapsing. Sheriff Reed placed him under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, arson, and attempted theft of property. Edward lowered his head in shame. As deputies led Jonathan from the courtroom, he looked back at Jacob. "This isn't over." Jacob answered quietly, "It is for me." Outside, the entire town gathered around Jacob and Abigail. People who had once laughed at Abigail now thanked her. Mrs. Harper hugged her tightly. "We judged you without knowing you." Abigail smiled warmly. "We all make mistakes." Sheriff Reed removed his hat. "Montana could use more women like you." Abigail laughed softly. "Montana could use more honest sheriffs." Over the following months, Black Creek Ranch flourished like never before. Using Abigail's ideas, they built new irrigation canals that carried fresh mountain water across every pasture. They planted orchards beside the creek. They introduced improved cattle breeding. They opened Montana's first cooperative livestock market, allowing small ranchers to sell together instead of competing against one another. Families who had nearly lost everything finally found hope. Prosperity spread across the valley. Within 5 years, Black Creek Ranch had become the largest and most successful ranch in Montana Territory. Railroads transported Walker cattle as far as Chicago. Merchants traveled hundreds of miles to purchase livestock. Young ranchers visited simply to learn Abigail's methods. Newspapers called her the woman who saved Montana ranching. Yet success never changed either of them. Jacob still repaired fences himself. Abigail still taught children every Sunday afternoon inside the old schoolhouse. Whenever travelers passed through Black Creek Ranch hungry or tired, they found a hot meal waiting. Jacob often smiled.